Chapter 1. Late in the evening, Malleus Fane sat brooding in a cave he flippantly referred to as his hub of human depravity. This hub, conveniently located in the depths of Acara's dungeon, was, in actuality, a gloomy, oppressive, diminutive office. Dim, flickering light from two poorly situated torches cast eerie shadows around the room. Thick rock walls, marred with a constantly trickling, putrid-smelling fluid that dripped annoyingly into pools of scummy water, did little to improve the atmosphere. The muted screams of tormented prisoners alone were usually enough to drive most people away, but not Malleus. To the contrary, the place suited his needs perfectly. True, few could endure such an office daily, but then few knew of the secrets that could be discovered in a pit of human degeneracy. He was pondering one such secret, his long, thin fingers drumming the smooth surface of his desk, when the door burst open. Malleus rose from his chair to greet his unanticipated guest. "Your Majesty, what a pleasant surprise." He bowed slightly, a gesture that was noticeably more derisive than respectful. Sneering, the king entered the room and perched on the simple wooden chair usually reserved for interrogating prisoners. He shifted uncomfortably, patently regretting his choice to sit down, and peered around distastefully. Clearly, he resented having to come here, and this knowledge was the only thing that offset the sour mood that a royal visit inevitably elicited in Malleus. The king obviously had something urgent to discuss, and he'd learned through experience it was faster to seek out Fane than to summon him. Naturally, this annoyed him, but there was nothing for it, as Malleus Fane was not one to be pushed around, threatened, or chastised. If you wanted his help, you went to him. Period. "Fane, my favorite snake in the grass." The king removed a large money pouch from his robes and dangled it in the air. "I have a favor to ask of you, dungeon keeper." "The great King Cassius has a favor to ask of me," Malleus scoffed, immediately determining just exactly what this favor was. The dungeon keeper purposefully reached across the desk and seized the proffered pouch. "I'm at your service." Fairly glaring over the mountain terrain, Equestria greeted the dawn as though awarding it with the status of chief antagonist. Each dawn seemed to arrive sooner than the last. They should have crossed these mountains by now. But in spite of her urgency and determination, the trek had proven harder than she'd anticipated. Vibrant orange, yellow, and golden hues merged along the edge of the horizon, drawing the eye away from the distant landscape that was still shrouded in the cloak of night. Equestria watched somberly as the autumn sun climbed higher, rising over the crest of the distant mountain tops with ease and grace, and wished she could do the same. Within seconds, the brilliant power of the sun was revealed. Its rays stretched across the countryside, infusing the scenery in a cheerful amber glow. Equestria had always admired the sun because of its fascinating duality. She was not unlike the sun herself, powerful, beautiful, and optimistic. She could heal, motivate, and inspire. And yet, when occasion called for it, she could be harsh, unrelenting, and absolutely formidable. Taking a deep breath, Equestria turned and peered down at her younger sister, Kessa, still asleep on the bundles of bracken hewn down and piled on the ground for a more comfortable sleeping arrangement. Moaning a little, Kessa squeezed her eyes shut as sunlight danced on her lids. Freckles lightly sprinkled her nose, enhancing the appearance of charming innocence and youthful beauty. which was even more pronounced while she slept. Her firmly braided hair had rebelled somewhat over the course of the night. Renegade blonde wisps poked out here and there, or were completely loose. Impatiently adjusting her white split-arm chemise and brown leather waist cincher, Equestria snatched her cape off her sister, who'd been using it for a blanket. Her thoughts were occupied with plans, wishes, and regrets. Foremost in her mind was a wish that she was at home with. She shook her head, forbidding such thoughts to resurface. Securely fastening her sword at her waist and her crossbow to her back, she swung her cape around her shoulders and tied it, chastising herself for her predisposition to dwell on the past. Squatting, she gently patted her sister's arm. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time to get a move on." Kessa groaned at the announcement, protesting, "I'm too tired." "I know. We must keep moving, though, or—" Waving her hand carelessly, Kessa rolled over, struggling with protruding twigs as she tried to achieve more comfort. "Just leave me." Annoyance flashed across Equestria's pretty features. "We've no time for dramatics, Kessa, or laziness." "Enjoying the occasional lay-in is hardly defined as laziness," Kessa muttered. "No, nor can your lay-ins be defined as occasional." Cracking an eyelid to peek up at her sister, Kessa snorted, but offered no further rebuttal. After a charged silence, in which she could almost feel the burn of Equestria's glare, Kessa finally relented. With a groan, she sat up and shot her arms up into the air in an exaggerated stretch that was accompanied by an equally exaggerated yawn. "Unless you want to be stretching those lovely limbs in a dungeon cell, I suggest you hurry up." Feeling the aches and pains of an uncomfortable night, of many an uncomfortable night, Kessa grimaced. "Right now," she paused as her stomach growled loudly, "that cell is sounding pretty good." Equestria's voice hardened like molten rock submerged in ice water. "Don't you even—" A sound from the depths of the forest made the two girls freeze, their senses alert. Deciding the culprit was likely more sinister than a simple woodland creature, Equestria swept her cape aside and reached for her crossbow, but not as swiftly as her sister grabbed her dagger and dashed into the woods after the source. "Kessa!" Equestria called, exasperated. Her sister could be so impetuous and irresponsible, charging into a dense forest after a suspicious noise all by oneself, with a mere dagger as defense, was rarely, if ever, advisable, especially if you had a warrant out for your arrest. Surveying her surroundings, Equestria positioned herself strategically and waited. A few minutes later, Kessa reappeared, the knees of her black pants dusted with dirt, her dagger replaced recklessly in its sheath on her belt, and her hand grasping the legs of a dead rabbit. A small twinkle in her eyes, Kessa declared, "Breakfast." Quite unexpectedly, for Equestria at least, a man stepped out of the trees. He was at least 6 feet tall, scrawny, dirty, and very unattractive, with a rounded chin, thin lips, squinty eyes, and a thin, crooked nose. Dressed simply in a pea-green tunic, brown pants, poorly made boots, and a ridiculously small hat, he appeared totally destitute. Ogling the girls and the rabbit solicitously, he affirmed in a raspy voice, "Hi, and it looks like a delicious one, too." Equestria's brow furrowed, her eyes gauging her sister, the rabbit, and the stranger suspiciously. Fingering the trigger of her crossbow, she demanded, "Who are you?" Pointing ostentatiously, he said, "I'm the rightful owner of that there rabbit." Eyeing him resentfully, Kessa held up her quarry for examination. "I don't see your name on it." "The trap has it sure enough. It be carved right into the metal," the man argued, tossing the trap on the ground for effect. "Surely you didn't miss that while you was grabbing my next meal." Noting an ineligible scribble etched into the device, Equestria's eyes slowly and intently rose to her sister, whose very posture was rigid with defiance. "I's just comin' to empty it when this here lightning bolt of a girl beat me to it." With an admonishing glance at her sister, who was now avoiding eye contact, but still clutching the rabbit tightly, Equestria prompted the man, "The name is barely legible. It's badly scratched." "My name's Black, miss. Look closer," he said, gesturing toward the markings as if they'd magically clarify. "Robert Black at your service." "Can't make a name out. It seems to have been deliberately scratched off, as if the owner doesn't want to be identified with the trap." She drew closer to him, realizing that she was as tall as him and a good deal more muscular. Black swallowed nervously. His eyes darted around, looking for the best escape route. "So, Mr. Black, do you have a license to hunt in these woods?" Kessa rolled her eyes. Leave it to Equestria to question the legality of everything. If it got her the rabbit, however, she'd be grateful. Black stiffened, his feathers ruffled. Apparently the emptiness of his stomach bolstered his backbone. "You girls have a license?" he countered. After an awkward moment, Kessa asked if Black really was at their service. If so, she argued, he'd let things be. Circumstances were dire, and they needed the food. Robert proved just as stubborn, though, in the end, on claims that his wife and children loved rabbit stew just as much as Kessa, and that the bunny, though small, would feed his family for a week, a rather exaggerated declaration in Kessa's mind. Robert Black departed with his conquest. Kessa's stomach growled again as she slumped against a log, defeated. Resting her chin in her hands, she said sulkily, "I bet he doesn't even have a family." Grinning, Equestria drew her sword and announced, "Since I know you won't move until your hunger is appeased, I'll go find us something to eat." At the sound of her sister's return, Kessa shoved the ring she'd been inspecting into her bodice. "I'm starving. What took you so long?" "Huh? Sitting here doing nothing boring you? Glad to see you at least managed to prepare a decent cooking fire without a catastrophe." Running her fingers through her loose hair, Kessa smirked at her sister's jib. "Barely. Almost set this mass of luxurious blonde curls alight. But at the last second, I remembered to move them out of my eyes afore striking the flint." Almost allowing herself a grin at the witty sarcasm, Equestria placed a large trout into the cooking pan. She relished the delectable sizzle and winced as her arm grazed the hot pan. "You okay?" Kessa asked, weaving her unruly hair back into a braid. She didn't wait for a response, knowing her sister wouldn't even acknowledge such a minor injury. "Equestria, I've been thinking, really. Isn't that the reason we're in this mess in the first place?" Equestria snapped. Their grueling journey was weighing heavily on her mind, and she was annoyed that she'd been so careless with the frying pan. "Wait, I'm sorry. It's the opposite. You weren't thinking at all." Silenced by the sharp retort, Kessa stared at the fire. Here, the chef distributed a healthy helping of fish to her sister, who glared at the wooden plate disdainfully. It was no secret that Kessa had never liked fish. In fact, it was the only food in the kingdom she didn't like. Eat it, Kessa, and be quick about it. We have to cross these mountains today. Equestria served herself the remaining portion and sat down next to her sibling. Watch for bones. Deciding to raise one positive point about that morning's meal, and hopefully lighten the mood as well, Kessa acknowledged. At least it's dead. Equestria winked, sinking her teeth into the cooked fish, too hungry to heed her own advice and watch for bones. Instead of observing Kessa meticulously pick out each and every bone, which was maddening considering their hurry, Equestria put out the fire and packed up their things. She had to do something to prevent herself from strangling her sister. Careful not to make a sound, Robert Black crouched next to a bush a few meters from the campsite, observing the girls with languid curiosity. Moments ago, when the gorgeous, dark-haired girl was absent, he'd spotted the blonde studying a shiny ring with a peculiar condemnation. Even with the distance between him and the ring, Black could tell it was worth a pretty penny. And yet, she appeared to despise it. Why? Imagining the food that expensive trinket would afford him, Robert had considered sneaking up and stealing it from the girl, causing him to lapse into fantasies of taking the girl as well. He'd rarely beheld such a beauty, never mind been with one. Wiping the drool from his chin, he reminded himself of her dagger, as well as the dexterity with which she'd wielded it, and quickly abandoned his scheme. She'd certainly make mincemeat out of him. Then the older girl reappeared with a very appetizing fish, and he was glad he'd resisted the temptation to attack. She looked tougher than the blonde. Smelling the cooking fish made his stomach growl. He wished he could go home, but he was afraid to move. He didn't want them to discover he'd been spying. Genius he was not, but he knew these girls were running from someone and would not appreciate being watched or overheard. Still, he didn't regret his decision to eavesdrop. Any tidbit of information about who these girls were or why they were on the run could prove useful, profitable even. Bored with their meaningless bantering and resenting the empty state of his own belly, Robert leaned against a tree, waiting. Rubbing his eyelids roughly with dirty fingertips, he tried to keep them from drooping. That morning, he'd risen pre-dawn to check his various traps for food, which had been scarce of late. In addition to starving, his body was plain worn out from working to find food. Slowly, exhaustion won out, and Black's head sagged as he drifted off. He awoke, suddenly, unsure of where he was or what he'd been doing. Hunger pains grated his stomach. He rubbed it, hoping that would help. It didn't. The dead rabbit next to his foot jogged his memory, and he looked toward the campsite. It was empty. Standing up, he stretched his scrawny limbs and decided he would check his remaining traps prior to heading back to the city. The traps were empty, like his stomach, but he had one more to check. After an hour or so of searching, he still hadn't located it. Hearing hoofbeats, he ducked behind a bush, trying to catch a glimpse of the road and avoid being seen at the same time. Black scolded himself for placing a trap so near the path. After the hoofbeats faded, he scurried amidst the trees, his eyes wide for signs his trap was in the neighborhood. When he finally found it, a short time later, he salivated with delight. Not only had he located his trap, but it contained another rabbit, larger than the first. Barely containing a leap for joy, he pounced on it. Something caught the corner of his eye. He peered round to see what it was. Beholding the dark figure of a man leaning against a tree, Robert jumped, falling backward like a kicked sack of potatoes. The figure wore black leather armor with a hooded ankle-length cape. The hood was drawn, obscuring the face. Twirling a knife in his hand coolly, as though it were a mere twig, the hooded man said menacingly, "I hate traps." He ceased twirling the knife. Black feared it was because he was preparing to skewer him. Very unsportsmanlike. The poacher gulped. Eyes wide, darting this way and that, he searched for a way to escape. A strong wind howled, blowing withered leaves from their branches and shifting the mysterious man's hood just enough for recognition. Robert Black squeaked like a mouse caught under a lion's paw. Dungeon keeper! Few civilians were familiar enough with Cyrene's dungeon keeper to identify him at a glance, unless they'd had the misfortune of crossing him or being close to someone who had. In the blink of an eye, Robert was pinned to the ground, the dark figure on one knee, hand restraining his prey and knife poised to strike. You know me, poacher? The growl was downright menacing. Yes, Robert did, unfortunately. This was not the first time he'd been at odds with the law. Years ago, he'd fallen in with a bad bunch that dabbled in all things illicit. One night, they'd visited a popular tavern, and their leader had been too handsy with the bar wench. When she'd protested, he'd struck her, and then tried to take her forcefully. They had far outnumbered anyone who'd dare oppose them, after all. What they hadn't accounted for was the presence of the dungeon keeper, who was tucked in a back corner, nigh invisible. Since Robert had been young, and even scrawnier than he was now, he'd been the assigned lookout. Lookout equaled non-participant, hence he'd been spared the dungeon keeper's wrath. 1 man against 9, the dungeon keeper had prevailed with ease. Robert Black would never forget how quickly and brutally his buddies had been dispatched. Nor did he ever want to give the dungeon keeper cause to tangle with him. He'd tried to stay on the straight and narrow ever since. Drat it all! Frantically racking his brain for a way out of this mess, Robert connected the dots. Presence of the dungeon keeper, girls on the run. 2 girls! He yelped. The dungeon keeper's eyes narrowed. Staying his weapon, he awaited clarification. Spare my life, lord. Stabbing his knife firmly into the ground next to Black's head, Malleus advised, Do not waste my time, poacher. Tell me what you know. That afternoon, the 2 young women were trudging up a rather steep mountain path when Kessa asked breathlessly, How many more peaks must we cross before lunch? Why do we have to take the mountain route? I'm exhausted. Not to mention starving. Rolling her eyes and wishing that for once Kessa could go without thinking about food for at least 1 whole hour, Equestria replied, You know why. She pushed a branch out of her way and peered back at her sister. We need to avoid being seen. Besides, I haven't spotted anything very appetizing along the way. Have you? Why are we tracking all over the place, though? Kessa thought it wise not to tell her sister that she believed anything edible was appetizing at this point. Perhaps when we cross this peak, we'll stop to eat. Clutching her stomach dramatically, Kessa pondered how she'd get by without even a snack. Why are we even going to Aquina? I doubt he'll offer me any assistance. I don't know where else we can go. Acara isn't safe. Renanin is out of the question, and the border to Copperund is too closely guarded. You saw that. A vision of the border of Copperund, its sky-scraping wall of sand glass that stretched far beyond the end of sight, filtered through Kessa's mind. Scads of soldiers, their customary copper and onyx-colored armor gleaming in the sunlight, patrolled the wall. Their orange and brown eyes, probing and perceptive, searched the mountains that separated Copperund from Acara for any hint of trouble. For any hint of anything. Surely those eyes alone could incinerate any threat like dragon fire. Perhaps that was an exaggeration of the long circulating legends and myths that swathed Copperund like a protective force field. Perhaps not. Though very rare, Copperundish males could have red eyes, and Kessa wondered if that was where the tales of fire-like vision had originated. Whatever the origin, she didn't want to test the validity of the tales. Having never been to the land border, Kessa was astounded at the stark contrast only a handful of kilometers exposed. The continental climate of her homeland gave way to a dry, arid one, and where Acara had grass, trees, dirt, and rock, Copperund had limited vegetation and burnished sand dunes that undulated on and on as far as the eye could see. A gate as monstrous and intimidating as a copper-scaled dragon met visitors at the end of the rocky path that descended from the Acaran mountain range. One didn't need to be an anthropologist or a mind reader to know that the Copperundish didn't welcome visitors. Their imposing gate, with its claw-like black metal portcullis and heavy wood-paneled doors studded with wrought iron clavos, was more likely to chew you up and spit you out than swallow you whole. Since either condition seemed disagreeable, Kessa had spun on her heels and started back up the mountain path, abandoning her hope of refuge in Copperund. I told you it was a waste of time to go there, Equestria continued, unaware that her sister had hitherto turned her out. They're too suspicious of strangers, and they've captured more escaped convicts from Acara than fish in the great water. Even Malleus doesn't chase fugitives into their land. He knows they'll end up in his dungeon eventually. Stopping, she peered back at her sibling, who was falling further and further behind. She put her hands on her hips. Seriously, Kess, we've no money, nothing worth selling, and few amenable connections. Translation? We have only a glimmer of hope for assistance. Our options are skin and bone. I'm going to be skin and bone if we don't stop to eat soon, Kessa complained, her thoughts quickly reverting to her hunger, since that was a problem that had a quick and relatively easy solution. The tall, black-haired beauty looked skyward, a fettered smile tugging a corner of her lip. Great Althalos, you're relentless. Kessa's voice reached a high note. It's hunger that's relentless. And in your case, incessant, too. Slipping in an apologetic grin ere withdrawing her dagger, Kessa asked, "Shall I go a-hunting?" "No need," Equestria sighed, pointing to the surrounding shrubbery. Gasping with glee, Kessa darted in the direction her sister had indicated. "Huckleberries! What a treat! Aren't you glad I said something?" As they filled their tummies with the delicious fruit, Kessa said, "Going to Aquina is too dangerous, don't you think? Given our history there, it's the first place they'll look." "First place, yes. That's why we've been trekking all over the place, as you put it. How long have we been on the run? A month?" "A month and 4 days," Kessa modified, popping a fistful of huckleberries into her mouth all at once. "Their interest in Aquina will have cooled by now, if it was ever warm. I'm hoping they'll think we'll avoid the place because we practically grew up there. I still think it's our best option, regardless, and he will help us." "But we had to cross close to Cyrene again to get to Aquina. Why do we need help anyway? We're—" "Kessa," Equestria interrupted impatiently. "I just explained why. But if you need it in simpler terms, we have one frying pan that we found and 2 plates that I carved. We've no supplies, no money, and no shelter. We won't last long, especially with winter closing in. We need help." "But why Pantheus? He can't stand me." "I wouldn't say that exactly." "Well, what would you say exactly?" "I'd say you have a penchant for causing him trouble." Kessa wiped her berry juice-stained fingers off on her black, long-sleeved tunic as she trailed her sister back to the path. She feigned ignorance when her sister stared down the bridge of her nose at her. Seeing that Kessa wasn't about to own up, Equestria started walking up the path, recollecting, "You stole his horse, almost killed his goldfish, and pushed him into the Irenian River, Kessa." Kessa shrugged, her sister's austere listing of past offenses barely rattling her. "A little shove is hardly criminal. He didn't know how to swim." "I was playing around." Equestria stopped short, turning to face her sister with an expression she hoped would underline the gravity of what she was about to say. "He nearly drowned." The words sunk beneath the rippling surface of Kessa's insincere nonchalance, just as Pantheus had sunk beneath the rippling surface of the river that day so long ago. Kessa had been so surprised when he hadn't resurfaced. She'd stood there, frozen, expecting him to surface in a cacophony of thrashing limbs and gasps for air. But he hadn't. Time had slowed. Equestria's cries for help had been muffled, scarcely penetrating her trance-like concentration. Had she really believed her willpower alone could save him? Her father had rushed past her, jostling her arm and rousing her from her stupor. Drops of water had sprinkled her face as he'd leapt into the Irenian with a resounding splash. Seconds had dragged on in rhythm with her anxious heartbeat. After what felt like forever, her father had bobbed up, gulped some air, and dove back down. He'd failed to find Pantheus. Kessa's heartbeat had intensified, pounding in her head and chest like a drum. Equestria had thrown an arm around her and pulled her close. Moments had inched by, and then, at last, Pantheus was tossed onto the grassy shore. He'd been completely still, not breathing. The girl's father, Aduard, had pulled himself out of the water, turned Pantheus on his side, and slapped him on the back. After a couple more slaps, Pantheus had coughed up a lungful of water and begun breathing again. It had been a close call. I honestly meant no harm. I thought if he just got in the water, he'd be fine, Kessa admitted. What about the time you stole his horse and, pardon me, but I only borrowed Falcon. Everyone overreacted. Without asking, you took Falcon for over a week when you were invited on vacation with friends. You wanted to see their cousin, that boy who worked at the Restless Chef Inn. Equestria watched her sister flush at the memory of her silly crush. Not to mention Winky. It wasn't my fault that stupid goldfish jumped out of his bowl. Glaring at her, Equestria cleared her throat and tapped her foot impatiently. Perhaps he did have a little help from me, but I had nothing to do with the cat. Equestria shook her head. Well, all right, I called the cat. However, I didn't intend... You'd better stop talking before I do take you back, Equestria advised quickly, her tone jovial. Her joviality tapered as she added, I won't even mention Daisyfield. Kessa's insides clenched painfully at the memory of what had occurred there. You just did. Fine. I won't discuss it. No, please don't. Memory jogged sufficiently? Can you understand why he, Pantheus, acts coolly towards you now? Coolly, Kessa repeated, her voice higher than normal. Coolly? On our last visit to Aquina, he didn't say a word to me the entire time. He did. Well, Miss Defender of the oh-so-absent, do tell. Kessa stormed past her sister, glancing backwards, careless of the roots and stones that posed tripping hazards. He said greetings, welcome, hope you are well, and farewell. You know, no one bothers to consider that I brought Falcon back unharmed, well exercised, and with a new bridle, I might add. Or that I rescued Winky from the cat after a bit. No real harm done. That goldfish lived to a ripe old age. For a fish. No one bothers to mention any of that. It's always poor Pantheus, troublesome Kessa. You were constantly sticking up for Pantheus, and still are, it seems. She snorted belligerently. It's like you're sweet on him or something. On the contrary, my dear sister, Equestria butted in front of her with the ease and grace of a swan. Since you notice every little thing he does or doesn't do, and are so attentive whenever his name comes up, I believe you are. Kessa paled, her mouth dropping open. When she recovered, her stuttered denial, that is the most absurd thing I've ever heard, was completely unconvincing. Equestria was not the least bit surprised, given the color of her sister's cheeks, that the rest of their journey over that mountain's peak was in silence. She was grateful for the reprieve from frequent inquiries of when they'd be eating next. It was obvious that Kessa was far too busy pouting to consider her stomach, growling or not.